Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan guru-murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week is a botanist, a gardener, and for the last few months, he has been strangely drawn into the culture wars that we seem to have been in ever since the killing, the murder of George Floyd. And we're actually recording this just in the wake of the Derek Chauvin murder trial in which he's been found guilty. James Wong, welcome to the podcast and thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Well, now you suddenly became a bit controversial because as Britain and the world, we're all sort of examining racial history, racism, our colonial past, talking about statues and diversity and all of that. You tweeted, absolutely, UK gardening culture has racism baked into its DNA. It's so integral that when you point out its existence, people assume you are against gardening, not racism. Epitomized, for example, by the fetishization of words like heritage and native. And all hell broke loose.
Yeah, I'm really surprised about that. I think that this happened in the middle of, the second lockdown or the beginning of the second lockdown. I'm always surprised about how people think that's controversial. I think very often on Twitter, the idea that something is controversial actually reflects more about society than necessarily what the tweet says. Everyone, I think, accepts that racism exists. And if it exists in all areas of society, how is it controversial to point out that it exists in gardening? I think what's really interesting for me as an ethnobotanist who is a scientist that studies the human interaction between people and plants is how this started and where it went. So I originally put it up, and this is something I've been talking about and doing lectures on for, a good half a decade. You start to see a couple of bot accounts mentioning it, and then within maybe about 2 or 3 hours, you start to see people who are known on social media for, I would say, extremely conservative views, who are known for a combative style. You'll start to see them mentioning that. And essentially, they're cutting and pasting their own messages. The same message repeats. And eventually, you'll start to see it being brought up by tabloids. And then your big fishers, your people with 6 million followers talking about it. One of the things I thought was surprising is that I engaged with a lot of people who, initially messaged me in quite an angry tone. And I said, well, do you think that racism does exist? And that, yes, it absolutely does. Do you think that what areas of it is silly then? Is it to mention that it exists in gardening? And then they said, no, that's perfectly legit. And I said, well, where's the problem then? I think the issue is when people misrepresent it, which is what I've seen consistently. To say that begonias are racist is one of the big ones that came up that I allegedly said, or that gardening is racist. I was really clear in my tweet to point out that gardening isn't racist, but it has some racist elements to its culture. So it's like saying kicking a ball is not racist, but that doesn't mean that there are elements of race problems in football, for example. Or for example, saying sewing is racist is ridiculous, but there are some elements of racism in the fashion industry. And I think conflating those is done very intentionally, and it's done really for a capitalist cachet. Basically saying, if you say this, you'll get more followers and you'll have more influence and then be paid more to write certain articles. And I think that's really surprising, particularly in the world of plants. Like, how is gardening suddenly considered so controversial?
I mean, you are an ambassador for Kew Gardens and declaration of interest. I'm a trustee. I'm on the board of Kew Gardens, and we've been going through a process there of saying, we also need to look at the history of how, these plants came to Britain and how that's part of our colonial past, how it involves examining the role of slavery and sugar and, how all of these things were transported around the world. And, there are big questions here that we need to examine. And again, some people think, well, this is ridiculous. This is the rewriting of history. But
sure.
Just talk us through what you think we need to examine.
I think I should make it really clear that I can absolutely empathize and identify with why some people may feel attacked by this kind of narrative. They may feel that this is erasing history and this is painting history in an unfair light, and it's doing it because of powerful forces. Whether that's an accurate representation of what's actually happening is different. So, for example, I first learned about how sugarcane was connected with the slave trade at Kew Gardens about, I think I was about 6 or 8, so this is in the 80s, and I learned about it from a sign. And so what Kew is planning on doing is giving more information on its signs for things that it was doing 3 or 4 decades ago. Now, I think what's fascinating really is how today that is considered controversial, because it wasn't considered controversial 3 decades ago. It's considered like it's a new thing that's just developed. And it's also considered that it's erasing history, when in reality, it's teaching more about history. I think part of the issue comes with, I think people think that to talk about colonialism, you have to feel a sense of shame. And it's something that you may feel pride about. It's something that you're meant to feel guilty about, like it's an attack upon who you are. And I can absolutely identify with why you may feel that way. But I actually, coming from, I grew up in Southeast Asia. My dad's from a former colony in Borneo. I don't think people should feel shame about things that happened in their past, but I don't feel that they shouldn't talk about them. I think that if you feel that you should censor the past and sweep it under the rug and never talk about it, it actually shows you do feel a sense of shame. If you're genuinely proud of where you come from and who you are, you should be able to examine and accept things that happened in your history, sometimes that you're very comfortable with and sometimes that you may be less comfortable with. So I think what's really surprising is these are efforts to make horticulture and gardening inclusive to everyone, and they're precisely being pitched as exclusionary, excluding people, when they're doing really the exact opposite.
I mean, when you talked specifically about those things, words like heritage and native,
yes.
What is it you think we need to understand about these words?
Okay. So I'm going to clarify. Many people will have understood that using the term native is racist in the context of gardening, or using the term heritage is racist in the context of gardening. And those are clearly ridiculous statements. That's not something I would have ever said. What I said, it's misuse and fetishization. So it's precisely the opposite. So I think that what's really fascinating about horticulture is, when anyone finds out that I'm a botanist or I work in horticulture, their first question to me is, oh, wow, so what made you interested in plants? And this was particularly when I was younger. When I was in my 20s, people would always ask me that. And I used to feel like I used to have to come up with a kind of a backstory to explain why I was interested in plants, particularly as a younger person. And then I suddenly realized my older brother, who's obsessed with football, no one has ever asked him. I called him up and said to him, Paul, has anyone said, oh, so Paul, why are you interested in football? Like, does it run in your family, or did you have a particular moment in your childhood that made you interested in football? It's taken for granted that football is fascinating. Now, to me, gardening is about communing with the natural world. There is nothing unusual or strange about being fascinated by nature. But I think gardening culture in the UK doesn't portray gardening as the creative pursuit of nature, which is what gardening really is. It also has layers and layers of cultural baggage that are attached to it. So, for example, in the UK, words like heritage are used as bywords for better. So a heritage garden or a heritage vegetable or a heritage fruit variety are automatically better tasting, stronger growing, more fitting with the local environment. We also have that with native. A native plant is instantly better resistant to pests, but ironically also really good for wildlife. It's less invasive and unlikely to affect local ecosystems, but at the same time is stronger growing. Now, what we need to understand is those are opposite statements. You can't have something that's less invasive and also better growing and stronger growing. They're mutually exclusive statements. So what we really have in many instances is a misunderstanding of those words used as a byword for better. And they're really not based on really much logic at all. They're based on a superiorist narrative, a nativist narrative. So, for example, when it comes to heritage, I'm constantly told like the best gardens and the best fruit varieties are heritage varieties. Whereas reality, when you ask about, so whose heritage are we talking about? Are we talking about my heritage? So as someone who's half from Borneo, it certainly isn't mine from that side, but who's someone who's also half from a really poor Welsh farming background on my mum's side, it certainly isn't her side either. When we talk about heritage in terms of gardens, what we're talking about is the gardens of the billionaires of the past. And so unless you can trace your ancestry to a handful of immensely wealthy landowners or the people that worked in their houses, it's not your heritage. And in many examples, we add the term heritage to things we like. So, you know, all those heritage tomato varieties, very few of them are very old. In fact, most of them have been bred in recent years because there's this idea that unusual shaped or unusual colored varieties of tomato are automatically better. Loads of them are bred from the 80s until now. But we add the label when we approve of something. Likewise with native, the idea that native plants are in all cases better for the environment is scientifically bankrupt. It has no basis in fact. And very often the things that we like the most, the poppies, the cornflowers, those beautiful native, in inverted commas, wildflowers, none of those are native plants. They're all invasive weed species that were introduced when cornfields were introduced to the UK. So my issue is not with the terms native and heritage, it's with their misuse. And what they really show is that in British horticulture, there is an idea that you have to be a specific type of person to be a gardener. You have to have a specific gardening style. You have to have a specific type of land that you're growing on. And if you deviate in even a very small way for any of those things, you're not a real gardener. Ironically, my message is about that there's nothing wrong with that traditional form of gardening, but there are many other forms, and there's nothing wrong with exploring different international ideas.
I mean, I suppose what you're also identifying, though, is the role of class in gardening, or the image of gardening in Britain.
Yes.
And because gardening in Britain does go back to the big houses, the big landscape gardeners, the capability browns, and all that kind of thing, it's seen by many, you know, probably wrongly, as a sort of a middle class pursuit.
What I think is really fascinating about that is, you know, there's a phrase that we hear a lot in gardening media, and I think we hear it often enough that we believe it, and that's that Britain has led the world in gardening for centuries. Now, I'm not saying that Britain doesn't produce amazing gardens and gardeners. I'd like to think that in some way I'm aspiring to that. But the belief that Britain has led the world in gardening for centuries is only an idea that you can sustain if you ignore everyone else's achievements and say, well, the only type of gardens that count are British gardens.
And if you don't go to China or India or Spain or any of those places.
Precisely, if your definition of a garden is limited to about 20 rich landowners from the 18th century on these tiny islands, then you can easily dismiss all the other ones. And that's a message that's been consistently charted out. And what I think is the most surprising about all of that is Britain does have a particular cultural interest in gardens and has contributed a lot to gardening, but all of its garden styles have consistently been imported. So prior to what we call the English garden style, the kind of the rolling green hills with lakes and little follies, it was directly copied from places like France and Italy. It was considered that gardens were mimics of the Garden of Eden, and the Garden of Eden was completely logical and laid out. It was symmetrical, it was ordered, trees and shrubs were clipped into geometrical shapes, and that's what Eden was like before the fall. After the fall, chaos ensued, and natural landscapes were horrible. All of this asymmetry and mud and things not working properly. You wanted to make them nice and neat. And that really changed with the English gardening school. And we're constantly told that the English gardening school came along, was developed in Britain, and then sent out around the world. What people gloss over is that asymmetry is an idea that was directly copied from East Asian artifacts, which were being brought to Britain around that time. And it was actually written and really widely acknowledged. People tried to create things like pagodas. They tried to create things like Orientalist bridges. The idea of that a sinuous lake in a rolling green landscape was really an entirely Asian idea. So what I'm really fascinated about is how we're very willing to accept that the previous very formal style that we used to have was imported from Italy and France. But this new style, we believe, just occurred and created out of the mind of Capability Brown, like it didn't come from anywhere. Was even at the time, it was really shown off. It was considered something really exotic and internationalist and innovative to bring these ideas from all over the world and admittedly turn them into something uniquely British, because those gardens are very different from the gardens they were aiming to copy. We did create our own stamp on those things. Whereas nowadays, our attitude is exactly the opposite. It's to conserve an idealized version of the past, which never really existed.
How much is the media to blame here? I mean, when I grew up, gardening TV was really important. It was really popular. And it was sort of one of the anchors of TV schedules. TV gardeners were huge celebrities who became very, very famous. Those days seem to have gone. And this is sort of a part of popular culture. And it is a really popular culture that seems to have dropped off popular media.
Well, I think I have my own theory about this. And I think it touches on a lot of the things we've previously discussed. And that's that once upon a time, TV food and TV gardening schedules were really quite similar. They had a similar area of output, they had similar popularity, and they were considered of similar status. And over the years, that's changed. And I think that if we look back to, people will say before Jamie Oliver, but I don't think it was, I think Jamie Oliver did a great job, don't get me wrong, but I think it was before Floyd. Keith Floyd really changed everything and how we talk about food TV. So once upon a time, TV chefs would have the white French hat, right? Everything would be pre-measured out and the ingredients would scroll up on the screen, you remember in the 80s? And the whole process was about what you're actually doing and what you're going to achieve. And it was considered very restrictive and quite serious. And over time, that's really changed. We've taken ideas and ingredients from all over the world. We've really embraced the cultures where they come from. So you would see someone like Floyd breaking out of a studio for the first time, being really casual, going all over the world and sometimes co-opting, sometimes sharing different ingredients and coming up with different ideas. And the focus was a little bit less on the end result, but was more about the process. It was more about enjoying food. So instead of being called cookery shows, which they were once called, they're now called food shows, because it's not the cookery that it's about. It's about the enjoyment and love of food. Jamie Oliver would have scenes with all his mates coming around and enjoying the process and enjoying the end result as kind of one big package. In that same era, gardening TV went to makeover. And so basically it was about, the scenes where they would make over a room and they would like chuck out the cushions and light the candles? Plants were just considered that. They were considered like outdoor tidying up, like outdoor soft furnishings. And when I was a kid, when my friends said they weren't interested in plants, I asked them like, well, what is it? What is it about them they don't find plants interesting? They're like every aspect of, from our color vision to our appendix, to how we see the world, the fact that our eyes are on the front of our head is down to millions of years of coevolution with plants. We're genetically and instinctively programmed to find them fascinating. So how can you not find plants fascinating? And they're like, well, it was, my first memory is when I was being dragged around B&Q and I just saw all these little like trays of different colored bedding plants. And I just saw them as like cushion fabric. I'm like, oh, of course you find plants boring if you consider them soft furnishing, or if you consider the goal is to have a perfect stripy lawn or a flat pack water feature. If you ask people who actually are gardeners why they're interested in gardening, it's never the end result. There's no such thing as a finished garden. It's about the process. So, walking around in nature has been demonstrated consistently scientifically to have amazing beneficial results on mental and physical health. But when you walk around a forest, you're really exploring that very passively. In fact, some scientific trials have put people on treadmills and shown them screens, like projections of artificial forest environments, and they've still seen a benefit. In gardening, not only are you observing nature in this really passive form, you're actually having a one-to-one conversation with it. You're planting the seeds and watching them grow and having a hand in shaping nature as much as you are enjoying it. So I think that the reason why gardening has decreased in recent years in popularity is because of that. But at the same time, what we see is a massive uptick in younger generations are getting obsessed with houseplants. So I have 500 houseplants at home, and houseplant sales are up 500%, I believe, in the last year. It's just astonishing. And the people that are doing this on Instagram. And most of the leading influencers in it are people of color. And they're not telling you, these are your jobs for the week, which is what we talk about on traditional gardening TV. They're not saying these are the rules that you have to follow. It's all about experimentation and maybe seeing like what a bunch of people are doing in Indonesia with plants, or maybe what a bunch of experimental people are doing in Hawaii or San Francisco. It's not about trying to copy what we did here 200 years ago, or saying that it has to be heritage, it has to be native, or saying that this is a particular way or a particular month you're able to do these things in.
Well, I mean, I wonder if these two things will actually come back together now because of the climate change agenda, and we should talk about that. But I mean,
yeah, sure.
In the short term, that has also led us to the whole question of diet, and we now talk about being plant-based in our diet, and that surely is also sort of inspiring a whole new type of interest in plants and what we can get from them in terms of food security.
I mean, there is a huge spike in interest in plants in the last 5 to 10 years. And I think there's a number of reasons for it, and particularly indoor plants. We'll often be told that younger people are interested in houseplants because it's trendy, because of a specific interior style they see on Instagram, or maybe because they can't afford gardens. In a world that seems increasingly virtual, like particularly in lockdown, so many of even our social interactions have occurred through a screen. It's nice to see something that is authentic, that is real, that you can nurture and has consequences. As we're getting less access to nature, particularly in things like lockdown, any exposure to nature has become heightened to us, has become more important.
But what about the importance of plants and trees in the climate change agenda? How do you think that changes the way we think about gardening and plants?
There are potentially two ways to look at this issue. I think that the gardens occupy a relatively small footprint, even in countries like the UK, which have a very high density of gardens. They occupy a really small footprint in terms of the country as a whole. So if we're talking about a climate change agenda, yes, if you're going to grow something in your outdoor space, there is a potential to make a difference. But this difference is infinitesimally small compared to other drivers you could do. For example, opting for sustainable palm oil would make a much, much bigger difference than, for example, not mowing your lawn as much to encourage wildflowers and carbon capture that way, or planting a singular tree. But I do think that the interesting thing about gardens is that they're barometers, really effective barometers for how we see what nature should be and our place in it. And they're also benchmarks for it. So if, once upon a time, the perfect garden was one that was neatly ordered and controlled. You'd have your stripy lawn at the front and your perfectly manicured edges to it. And you'd have bedding plants in there that you change 4 times a year, so they were permanently in flower. I mean, everything might as well be plastic, because that's the look you were aiming for, this total control. And nowadays, the fashion in gardens, the idea of the perfect garden has really changed. Things like edibles are much more important. Things like wildlife are really coming up to the agenda. So I think that's a really neat barometer for our understanding of nature. And if we can change people's attitudes to their gardens, it changes the benchmark and therefore changes culture itself. So I believe this recent flowering of interest in horticulture, indoors and out, is really kind of indicative of a larger change of how we approach nature and the importance of conservation, and can actually inform our decisions. If you're interested in plants because you've seen that monstera on Instagram and you've seen that putting out new leaves and you're fascinated about that, you suddenly might care about where that plant comes from and how it may be treated in the wild, for example. We only conserve things we care about, and we only care about things we know. And I think gardens and houseplants are a really neat step to do that. So although I don't think we're going to change the world through the actual footprint of a garden itself, by changing our mentality and educating ourselves about the power of the natural world through gardens, we can make a really massive change.
Can we get to the question you were laughing about before, about why are you interested in plants, which is at what point did you want to become a horticulturalist or study this? And
I'm so interested in it, I think it's weird other people aren't. So I then had to, when the people kept on asking me, I had to think back, and I went, okay, well, I grew up in Southeast Asia, so perpetual summer. So maybe I had more access to gardens. And on top of that, in Southeast Asia, people still use plants for things. They're not considered something that's outdoor decoration, like a doily. They're considered, something that might solve your headache or something that may taste delicious in your dinner. So I had a grandma that would take me around the garden. And to me, the garden wasn't just pretty, it was a supermarket. There were solutions to all the problems in everyday life. And I used to think, okay, well, maybe that's it. That's the origin story. But I have lots of cousins and lots of brothers and sisters, and none of them have had that. I think that innately people are fascinated by nature. No one asks kids why they're interested in animals, for example. Or, I'll very often hear that schools saying, oh, we really tried to get kids interested in nature. And so we sowed some seeds with some 8-year-olds and they found it fascinating. And I sort of think, half good for you, half obviously. It's the miracle of life unfolding in front of them. They planted some magical seeds and they sprung to life. It's really easy to find that interesting. I think we've done a really good job in modern Western culture of putting up barriers that can even suppress our most basic instincts behind it. If you're taught in school, the first thing you see about plants is the photosynthesis diagram. I'm a botanist and I probably couldn't draw that off the top of my head. Whereas the first thing you see with plants is David Attenborough wildlife documentaries with, lions running across the Serengeti. It's a soap opera of the natural world in front of your eyes. I think we've done a really good way of creating barriers that will tell people what they can and can't do about plants. So, for example, people will get worried about Latin names. They'll think that they've got to pronounce them in a certain way, and that gardens have all these rules, and if you do them wrong, everything is going to fall apart. I consistently hear from people, I love plants, I love flowers, I love the natural world, but I can't grow them because I have a brown thumb. There's no such thing as a brown or green thumb. You just, like all of the best horticulturists I know, all we get to talk about when we go to the pub is all the plants we've killed. We just don't get put off. We carry on going until something works. With Latin names, there's no correct pronunciation of Latin. It's a dead language. So if someone corrects your horticultural Latin, which people do in the horticultural community as a power move, all they're demonstrating is they know nothing about Latin. Horticultural Latin isn't even really Latin. It's a mixture of Latin and ancient Greek and half a dozen other languages. I think that it's really the opposite question. Everyone is interested in plants. Some people, however, have been convinced otherwise due to exclusive aspects of gardening culture that aim specifically to ignore and marginalize some groups.
But it's partly also about knowing the roots and making these things commonly known. So how did you become a botanist or a horticulturalist? And how should people do it now?
Okay, so I work as a horticulturist, but I'm not trained as one. I'm trained as a botanist. I studied ethnobotany at Kew Gardens and the University of Kent, did a master's degree in it. So it's quite a traditional route. Surprisingly, there are no botany degrees left in the UK. There's traditionally 500 animal science students for every plant science student. And there's even been research to demonstrate that if you use the word botany or plant in modules in a plant science degree, people are less likely to take them. And this is people who self-selected to want to do a degree in the subject. So I think that there is a huge amount of education and chipping away at perceptions of what we really do to be able to be broken through. But I think that's happening now. Maybe I think 5 years ago I was sat in a a meeting for a big horticultural body, a collection of all the different industries. And they were desperately trying to get younger people involved in horticulture because they just weren't. Their target demographic was getting into their 70s, and they were really almost panicked about how to get the next generation in. And none of them actually bothered talking to any younger people or looking at any hashtags or looking at social media. Their thing is, weren't garden makeover shows really popular 10 years ago, 15 years ago? We've just got to get one of those commissioned and automatically people will be interested. Well, of course they weren't. And of course those shows have been commissioned. When we really see an uptick in interest is when we see people doing it online, because you don't have those gatekeepers in horticulture. Working in horticultural media, there's consistently gatekeepers that will say what people are interested in and what they aren't. On things like social media, you can put on whatever you want. And sometimes people will disagree with you and not like what you have to say, as I will know. Sometimes they really engage with it. And if you have that diversity of opinion, very often you'll reach groups that have been traditionally excluded. So when you look at the hashtag plant daddy people that are trending on Instagram, or the leading lights in it, which can have almost 1 million followers, they're people from really unexpected groups that aren't wearing braces, that aren't out in an idyllic countryside set in 1880. They're people who are doing experiments, people who are kind of up to international ideas, people who are up to plant swapping between them, not debating the Latin pronunciation of something.
So how do we get them into places like Kew Gardens?
I think they already are. If I go into a garden centre, I'm always the youngest person there. This has been true since I was 20, and now I'm 40. I'm still 2 decades younger than the youngest person there. Whereas if I go to if I look at people who follow me, or if I look at the houseplant specific fairs that have opened up in London, I went to one in 2019 in September at the Garden Museum that I couldn't actually see the end of the queue, and everyone was a decade or 2 decades younger than me. So things like the hashtag glass houses are really popular on a lot of the social platforms, and you'll see loads of younger people already going to places like Kew. And I think people are interested in history, people are interested in nature, people are interested in the world around them and the environment, and all of those things are what plants are. Plants aren't complex pruning rules. Plants aren't necessarily, and I love Chelsea Flower Show, but it's not necessarily creating the perfect garden that will cost millions of pounds at the Chelsea Flower Show, complete with heritage gardening tools that no one's ever used. They're just as props. They are about the enjoyment of communing with the natural world, which anyone can do.
I suppose what you're identifying, though, is that there is clearly a gap between the gardening establishment, and
Yes.
that is everything from the RHS and Chelsea Flower Show and Gardener's Question Time and all that kind of thing, and what you're saying is happening in reality and on Instagram and in young people's homes, and that's a much more diverse group of people. So why is there this gap, and how do you think you bridge it? Because how unusual are you, for example, as somebody with Malaysian ethnic origins or Borneo ethnic origins in gardening? Are there any famous black gardeners in Britain? Okay,
so I would say that there is a slight difference here. So I would say that the RHS and people like Kew and people like Gardener's Question Time are actually really open and excited and embracing of all the different ideas. I think it's portrayal in media which is slightly different. So there's slightly different arguments. One is people in horticulture actually wanting to change it and being open to new ideas, which I believe we genuinely are. And the other one is people who don't work in horticulture who largely are curators of its image. So TV, magazines, books, for example, and like the portrayal of what's actually happening in horticulture as opposed to what really is happening. So when I first wanted to design a garden at Chelsea Flower Show, I was walking around with some of my mates. I think I was 22, 23. And I said, I could do better than this, being filled with arrogance. They all said consistently, James, there's no way you can do this. You actually have to be someone or know people to do this. I went, well, there must be a form on their website. And they all laughed. So I went home because we didn't have smartphones back then. So I got home, got on the computer, and you know what? There is actually an application form that you can fill in. And I filled it in and I got accepted. And I think that's so exciting. The fact that I was straight out of uni, no experience, definitely the wrong surname on the application form. And I wanted to do things that were really different from anything that happened before. And they judged the application based on what they believed I could deliver and nothing else. And I got in at that ridiculously young age with really, qualifications in botany, but no qualifications in garden design. I just thought I knew what I was doing. So I love the OHS from then. And they've really demonstrated to me that it's really a meritocracy. I think the difference is the portrayal of these elements, very recently we started to see different people in gardening land from different backgrounds. But certainly when I started Gardener's Question Time, I think I was probably the first person of color in the history of the BBC. I may be wrong with that, but that wasn't that long ago. That was, 2011, I think. So I think things are changing, and there's another slightly tricky area within gardening. One of the arguments behind why there's so little diversity in gardening is people aren't applying for those roles. So if you were to try and get a diverse crew on a gardening show, you would really have to pick people for their ethnicity above other concerns. And I find that personally problematic, because I'm often told the only reason why I got my job is because of my ethnicity, when I know it's quite the opposite. It's me calling people up and knocking on their doors, not going away until they give me a job. It's really easy to pick for diversity, to create a team that looks diverse, but basically talks about the same stuff. What's much harder is thinking, what are the barriers that are stopping people from applying in the first place? If we keep talking about heritage all the time, and when we say heritage, mean the heritage of about 20 families of rich white people from 200 years ago, and stick Union Jacks all over everything, and portray a fictional Disneyfied version of our past, and then a surprise no one from ethnic minorities feels identified with that. Is there something wrong with that that's creating these barriers? And I think those things are much harder to do, to really ask ourselves some harder questions and figure out if that's happening. So I can definitely tell you that I've been hired before to talk about gardens and been told to essentially read the script verbatim. And even if I disagree with it, even if I can point out the things that are either scientifically inaccurate or are very Western-centric takes, I've been told this script has been approved, you have to say it this way. And my attitude to that is, well, you're very open to faces of color, but not voices of color. You just want us to read out a script that is exactly the same as everyone else on the show is doing. I've done some talks to encourage younger people into horticulture at colleges around the country. And I showed them some examples of horticulture in Singapore and in throughout Southeast Asia, and in places like North America, where they're doing really exciting ideas. And I was told consistently by quite a few of the professors that, James, you have to understand that these are horticultural students, that you have to get them to stick with the tried and tested. And I found that probably more problematic than anything else I've heard in horticulture. Can you imagine if London College of Fashion said, you don't want any kind of Lady Gaga meat dress stuff. What we really need is some sensible shoes and M&S t-shirt, or architecture. No, forget any of this cantilevered sky garden business. What we need is more like Barrett Homes cut and pasted across the country. So that's where I think that the UK does lead the world in fashion. It does lead the world in music. It does lead the world in many aspects, or you can argue that. But I don't think we can argue that it leads the world in horticulture anymore. It leads the world in marketing, the fact that we once were really good at horticulture when we were open to new ideas and when we were experimental. To a large extent, we're just copying our past.
So you're clearly thirsty for change. If you could change the world anyway, what would you do?
Oh, that's a good question. There are many things that I think are important about the world today. I think that conservation of biodiversity loss, of habitat loss are really important. I think the equality and lack of discrimination are really important. And so there are so many different things to choose from. Perhaps the most important thing is education, because education underpins all of those things. And of course, things like inequality are barriers to getting that education. But if we could just magic wand and create education from nowhere and awareness, then we would make such strides towards protecting our planet and giving people equality within it. And I don't think we would have the same level of convected culture war that's happening at the moment, because I would be very surprised if what plays out on Twitter is actually indicative of how the average person really thinks, or whether how much of it is a pantomime to attract clicks. And I think that if you're really educated, you can see that there's nuance to arguments, and not everything has to be a black and white argument or portrayed as a black and white argument. People will see that, you know, you might disagree with me, and that's great, because that's more diversity. And the world becomes a better place, and horticulture becomes a better place when people can have lots of different ideas and be able to express those and be able to create loads of solutions to the novel problems that we face, rather than being limited to like a really fine line of one or two of them.
James Wong, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for sharing your ways to change the world. It's been a fascinating conversation. Our producer is Rachel Evans, and you can watch all of these interviews on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel. Until next time, bye-bye.